Rahab or Rahab. And I think that it's a bit sad in a way that she's always remembered as Rahab the prostitute rather than Rahab the woman of faith, because that's the main message really that I think God the Holy Spirit wants us to gather from this story in Joshua chapter 2. More of that in a minute. I think it's true to say that most of us like to boast a little bit about our ancestors, you know, our forebears, our family tree, as it were. Maybe you have a grandmother or a great-grandfather or something like that who achieved something remarkable or was quite famous perhaps in their day. So I thought I'd share something about our family with you, just to show off a little bit. My wife, Kathy's grandfather, was a very famous sportsman, and you'll have a few photos of him. There he is, being carried off the field in Paris. He was captain of England rugby, and it was a winning match, and so he's carried head and shoulders. His name was W.J.A. Davis, OBE, which means something if you're British, Order of the British Empire. He played outside half, fly half, whatever you like to call it, for the England rugby team. He was the captain as well. In fact, he captained England and only lost once in 20 international matches that he captained, and that was against South Africa in 1913. If you visit rugby's Hall of Fame, some of you don't even know what I'm talking about. Rugby. Okay. Well, one day you'll be educated. If you visit Rugby's Hall of Fame in Twickenham, London, you'll see he's there honoured, W.J. Davis, OBE. Another photo I think is coming up. There he is. That's in Twickenham. He's the guy in white on the left. He's introducing his England team, as you do in these sort of occasions, to George V. That's the king, George V. And he's introducing his team. So, WJA, William John Abbott Davis, you can look him up in Wikipedia, introducing the English team to King George V in 1922. Okay, so, you know, shake a hand. Very famous grandfather. Well, on the Jenkins side, that's the Davis side, on the Jenkins side of the family, we can trace our family back to 1610. Woo! To the founding of a pottery. There's the Iweni pottery. It's still got, oh, you can't see it very well, but there it is. It's in the Vale of Glamorgan in South Wales. Iweni pottery, founded in 1610 by David John Arthur Jenkins, and it's the oldest working pottery still in Wales, one of the oldest in the UK. Still operates today. If you go to the, again, you don't know what I'm talking about. If you go to the National Welsh Folk Museum in Cardiff today, you'll see the history of the pottery, documented, photographs of, well, not of the chap who, but my grandfather, David John Jenkins, and actually my father, before he went into the ministry, was quite a good potter. And there in the museum is the history of the pottery. 1610, we can trace our family back at least to that. And it's still in the family today, I think. So there's my cousin, Alan Jenkins. That's his daughter, Caitlin, who now runs the pottery. Caitlin Jenkins, she's showing the pottery to Prince Charles in 2013 when he visited. Ooh. So there we are. That's our families. And I'm sure you've got the same sort of interest about your own ancestors, especially people that you're proud of. And, you know, of course, you tend not to mention the people who might not be so praiseworthy in your family tree. You tend to pass over those scandals. Like my mother's great-grandfather, who apparently was a wealthy landowner in South Wales, outside of Cardiff. He owned many farms. He was, for his day, he was very wealthy. This is my mother's great-grandfather. But we don't talk about grandfather Newcomb much, because unfortunately, well, sadly, he sold all his land. He had to sell all his land. He got into debt. He was an alcoholic, and he died in poverty. Well, yeah. It's not something that we talk about, Grandpa Newcomb on that side. I just heard about it, you know. It's quite remarkable, therefore, isn't it, if you think about family trees and who you're proud of and who you don't mention. It's quite remarkable when you think of the family tree of Jesus, the Messiah, the Son of God, which is recorded for us in Matthew's Gospel and also in Luke. But in Matthew's Gospel, in the first chapter, it's probably the bit of the Gospel that we never read. At Christmas time especially, we go straight to Matthew 1, verse 18, where the story of the birth of Jesus, we think, really properly begins. But of course, the Gospel, the good news, begins before that. And that's why Matthew, in his genealogy, includes that long list of begats and begets, or depends what version you're using. He was the father of so-and-so, and so-and-so was the father of that. If you read that genealogy carefully, you'll find some very surprising names. Some of whom you would not expect to find in a list of the ancestors of Jesus Christ, the Messiah, the Son of God. Of course, there are some very illustrious names there. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, kings like David and Solomon and so on. Those are the sort of names you would expect perhaps to find there in the ancestry of the King of the Jews. But there are some surprising names as well. For a start, there's some women mentioned. That is surprising given the patriarchal society and culture in which that time operated. But there are women mentioned. And who are they? Well, working backwards, there's Mary, of course, the Virgin Mary, rightly respected and revered by the church, Jesus' mother. But then there's Bathsheba, Uriah the Hittite's wife, who bore Solomon to David. So, hey, hang on a minute, that's a sort of implicit admission that Jesus' ancestry includes an adulterous relationship. Well, then before that there's Ruth. Well, okay, she's all right. No, she's not. Hang on. She's not a Jew. She's a Moabite. And then before that, you come to Rahab, who we heard about in the reading today, Joshua 2. Why is she included? Rahab the prostitute. Well, she's included because she is an important link in the family line of Jesus, the Son of God, our Messiah. And yet she was not an Israelite. Neither was Ruth. And not only that, of course, Rahab, according to the text, was not an Israelite, she was a woman, and she was a prostitute. Why? Why is that included? Well, you see, I think what Matthew is telling us, what God the Holy Spirit is wanting us to understand right from the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, he's wanting to tell us that the gospel is all about God's grace. It's all about God's grace. And because it's all about God's grace, there's hope for us all. God's grace means that no one is excluded from the good news of God, from the good news of the gospel, from his kingdom on the grounds of gender, or race, or religion, or lifestyle. No one is beyond the pale. No one's excluded on those grounds. Tamar, well, I didn't mention her, Tamar, she's there. Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, they're all there to remind us of the inclusive nature of God's purposes, God's plan, God's grace, God's love. Now, that's not to mention, of course, all the men who are in the list. You tend to just home in on the women, of course, and say, wow, it's fantastic, Rahab's there and Bathsheba's there. Think of the men. They're equally undeserving, even the greatest of them. There's Jacob, he's a twister and a deceiver. There's Judah, who, if you're under 18, cover your ears, had sex with his daughter-in-law, Tamar. There's David, who is also a murderer and an adulterer with Bathsheba. There's Manasseh, a murderer and adulterer, who the Old Testament tells us filled Jerusalem with the innocent blood, and according to tradition killed the prophet Isaiah. They're there as well in that family line. In other words, Jesus, though he himself was without sin, he was born from a long line of sinners, both men and women. Why? In order that he could redeem sinners. That's the good news. People like you and me. Because really we're no better. And so remarkably, in the middle of this list in Matthew of sinful people comes the name of Rahab. a pagan and a sinful woman. Why? Because really, the story of the book of Joshua would lose nothing really if that chapter 2 is left out. You could go straight from the end of chapter 1 into chapter 3 and there'd be nothing lost in the flow of the story and the flow of the events. It wouldn't be interrupted. But no, here at the beginning of the history of Israel, entering the promised land, is the story of the first conversion of a pagan woman, therefore highlighting the truth of God's mercy and grace. A pagan woman prostitute is included in God's plans and purposes and God's grace. So there's hope for all. Then, of course, if you read the rest of the Bible, in the New Testament, there are 2 further references to Rahab. 2 other reasons why Rahab is included. In Hebrews 11, as you probably know, in that great chapter of the heroes of the faith, that hall of fame of Old Testament believers, the writer in Hebrews 11 and verse 31 says this, by faith, Rahab the harlot, prostitute, did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she'd welcomed the spies in peace. So Rahab is included amongst all those great names as an example of faith. True faith. By faith, Rahab. She was a woman of faith. Faith found in an unexpected place, an unexpected person because of God's grace. And then if you turn later in the New Testament to the letter of James, in chapter 2 and verse 25 we read this, was not Rahab the prostitute also justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out another way? For as the body without the spirit is dead, so faith without works is dead. So here's another reason why she's included. Here it's not simply because she's a woman of faith, but it's because her faith is seen in her actions. James uses her as an example of a woman of true faith, genuine faith, not just believism, not just saying it, because her faith is seen in the way in which she behaves. Her faith causes her to act in a certain way. Her faith affected her life. So as we look at this woman of faith this morning, just those 2 aspects in a bit more detail, let's think first of all about what we can learn from Rahab, a woman of faith, her confession. Her confession. Remember the situation here? Joshua and all the Israelites, they were camped on the east side of the Jordan River. They were getting ready to cross and enter the promised land. As part of his preparations for this, Joshua sent these 2 spies that we read about. Sent them ahead across the Jordan into the land. He told them particularly to spy out Jericho. That was the first biggest city settlement that they would have to encounter once they crossed the Jordan. So the 2 spies entered Jericho, we're told, and spent the night in the house of Rahab, the prostitute. Though, by the way, we don't find any indication that they were using her services as a sex worker. I'm sure it was a good military ploy, no doubt, simply just to keep a low profile. They didn't want people to be asking lots of questions of them, and so this was a good place to go, no doubt. But their encounter with Rahab, in her house, or in her inn, as it could possibly be translated in from the Hebrew, it raises these intriguing questions, doesn't it? And the number one being, how did Rahab then become a believer in Yahweh, in God, in the God of the Jews, so that she's included now in the New Testament as a woman of faith? How did she become a woman of faith? And the answer to that question really comes in the middle of the passage. Verse 11, she says, "For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below." The Lord your God is God in heaven above and on earth below. Now, how did she come to that confession? Well, that confession of faith was based on the truth that she'd heard about God. The truth she'd heard about God. About Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. What had she heard? Well, she tells us, or tells the spies, she'd heard something about the majesty of God. The might, the power of this God. I know, she says to the spies, I know that the Lord, Yahweh, has given this land to you, and that a great fear of you has fallen on us, so that all who live in this country are melting in fear because of you. We have heard how the Lord dried up the waters of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, what you did to Sihon and Og, the two kings of the Amorites east of the Jordan, whom you completely destroyed. And when we heard of it, our hearts sank, or literally our hearts melted with fear, and everyone's courage failed because of you. You see what she'd heard? Rahab had heard about the mighty power, the unique, the supreme power of this majestic God. Faith grows out of hearing what God has done for his people, how he has acted to deliver them and to bring them into the freedom of his kingdom, to enjoy his reign, his people in his place, under his reign, enjoying his peace and blessing. And so Rahab could see then that her world of Jericho was destined for destruction. The kingdom of Yahweh was advancing. So she needed either to join it or perish. Surely that's the spiritual truth for us all. And on the basis of what God had done, she confesses the supreme majesty of God. The Lord your God is God, in heaven above and on the earth below. That's a confession of faith in the unique God of heaven and earth. She realizes, she confesses that the so-called rival gods of her tribes and of the tribes of the Canaanites and all the other tribes around her, they're no gods really at all. There is only one God, one true supreme God. This God, Yahweh, is the one true God before whom all heaven and earth must bow, because he is God alone. And this knowledge and her confession of the one true God leads her then, secondly, to ask for mercy from this all-powerful God. Rahab had heard about the majesty of God, and so now she looks in her own way, she looks in faith for mercy from this God. She asks to be rescued, to be saved. You know, that's a sure sign of genuine faith in God, saving faith in God. Such a faith, saving faith, never rests content with just being convinced about the reality of God, some great being. No, saving faith presses on to take refuge in this God, to ask for salvation from this God. And so she not only trembles before his majesty, but she also senses that there is mercy in this mighty God. She knows she must somehow escape the destiny of a people, her people, who refuse to worship this God. And so she asks for mercy from this God. She makes this plea for salvation to the servants of this God. Isn't God merciful, wonderful? There's no way she would have understood all the history of the Israelites and so on, but we know wonderfully, we read later in chapter 6 and verse 25, that Rahab and her household were saved when the city of Jericho fell. Her confession of faith was accepted by God and by the servants of God, the spies, and by Joshua and so on. Her confession of faith was genuine. And that brings us to the second point about her faith, not just in Hebrews that she was a woman of faith, but the point that James seems to emphasize. She was a woman of faith because it was seen in her actions. So secondly, a woman of faith demonstrated in her actions. True faith in God, saving faith in God, always shows itself in the way we act. You cannot say you have faith in God, that you trust in Jesus Christ as your Lord and Savior, and then continue to behave in a faithless way. It just doesn't make sense. And that's why James says his famous words, isn't it? That faith without works or faith without action is dead. It's not genuine faith. And that's why he gives the example of Rahab in his letter in the New Testament. She didn't just believe, she acted. Her faith is seen in her actions. Just think about the way in which Rahab's faith affected her actions. She welcomed the 2 spies into her home. She hid them from the king's men. She protected them from arrest and probably certain death. She told them how to leave and where to go so that they wouldn't be caught. She even misled the king's soldiers with her directions. Interesting moral issue there, which we'll come back to later perhaps when we think about the whole book of Joshua. But she gave the spies vital information about her people, about how they were thinking about the Israelites. Verse 8, I know the Lord has given you this land, and that the fear of you has fallen upon us, that all the inhabitants of the land melt away before you. So Rahab had a vital, real faith in God that affected her actions. She risked her life in her actions. And then, of course, later on, as I said, we read in the book that she obeyed the instructions of the spies regarding her way of rescue. Her faith was seen in her actions. She obeyed the instructions. The Israelite spies, remember, we didn't read it all, but they promised that she would be saved if and only if she tied a scarlet cord from her window frame, from her house on the wall of the city. And so the Israelite army would be able to see this sign as it approached Jericho. Put that scarlet cord there. And she obeyed those instructions. You know, a few years earlier, the Israelites themselves, remember, had gone through an amazing rescue by God. In the living memory of these Israelites, most of them would have been children, but others would have heard. They would have heard about that amazing Passover night when God had gone throughout the whole city of Egypt and the land, and had slain the firstborn of every household. But in the households where there was the blood, the scarlet blood of the Passover lamb that had been smeared on the door frames, God spared those families, Exodus tells us. Those were the houses of the faithful Israelites. Now, is it, I don't know. I don't think it's speculating too much to say here we have the same sort of symbolism. Not scarlet blood, but a scarlet cord. Not a door frame, but a window frame. And in both cases, a sign of God's saving grace, of rescue. Is it too much, I wonder, thinking about this week and reading around some of this, is it too much to wonder about the significance of that sign? Was it the case that Rahab could get away with hanging out a scarlet cord from her window in the wall because it was maybe a sign of her trade? An ancient version of the sort of red light district of Jericho? I don't know. Could well have been. And by hanging out that sign, her place was identified. Well, we can't be sure, but by his grace, God turned then that sad and sordid symbol of sin, which had identified her place, her inn, her business, that symbol of sin and abuse, into a wonderful sign of salvation for her. Now, we can't be sure about that, but we can be sure, and we do know, don't we, of another sad and sordid symbol that God has turned into a wonderful sign of salvation for the whole world. What sad and sordid symbol of abuse? Well, I'm talking about the cross of Jesus, on which the Prince of Glory died. The Prince of Glory was crucified. That Roman instrument of torture, the hangman's noose or the electric chair of its day, in the Roman Empire. The cross of Christ, that horrible sign, has become for us the wonderful way that God rescues us from the coming judgment, from the coming destruction of all who will not worship him as sovereign, of Lord of heaven and earth, and who do not go to him for rescue. But you see, saving faith, real faith, acts on that knowledge. And so we have to come to that cross in humility and repentance, and we have to confess our lostness apart from the salvation he offers. There is no other hope. And if we say we have that saving faith, and we made that confession of trust in him, then that faith, friends, should be seen in our lives, in our actions. So, today as we think about this woman of faith, this story from Joshua 2, as we think about faith, can I ask you, as I ask myself really, to seriously think about your faith? To reflect on the nature, the condition of your faith? Does it affect the way you live? Has it transformed you? Because that's the sign of true faith. Does your faith rest entirely in the mercy and the grace of God shown to us in the cross of Jesus Christ? Saving faith. And if it does, then does your faith in God truly affect what you do? Does your faith make a difference in the way that you live your life, Monday to Saturday? Does your faith have a radical effect on your choices, your life choices, on your behavior? Does your faith have a real impact on the way that you spend your money, how you use your time? Does your faith affect the risks you take, if you take any, for the purposes of the gospel, for living for Jesus? Like Rahab, are you willing to risk? Does your faith impact the way that you regard and treat other people? Do you welcome them, even though they're not like you, not from your tribe? And what about the way in which you see the future? What's your hope? Does your faith really shape today because your future is secure because you're trusting in Yahweh, the God of the covenant and of the new covenant demonstrated for us in Jesus? Rahab was a woman of faith, and because of her faith, because of her beliefs, her behavior was changed too by the grace of God. And so, coming back to the beginning, far from being ashamed of her, she's an ancestor to be proud of. She's a great example of faith. Because when she saw God's kingdom coming, she decided she needed to be part of it. Even if it meant acting on that decision made her an outsider, a traitor to her own world. She put her trust in God to save her, which he did, and her whole family. And surely that's the spiritual truth. That's how God deals with us today. The take-home message is this: God's kingdom is coming. It has come in Jesus, but it's coming in all its fullness. And if you want to be part of that kingdom and not to be left outside, then you must put your faith in God and in his way of escape from that judgment. And you join his family. You become members of his kingdom, and you act on that faith in your living every day, so that others can see the reality, not just of what you say in your belief, but how that is borne out in your behavior. Rahab, a glorious example of faith. Not just believing, but acting on it. And risking, because she joined God's kingdom. Well, we're going to stop there today, and Ola is going to come and lead us now in a song of worship with the group. and then we'll sing our closing hymn to finish.